Before the clang of armor and the echo of swords, before the great banners fluttered above the hills of Europe, there was only fear, a quiet, creeping fear of the unknown, of raiders from the coast, of rival lords from the next valley, of the endless dark that stretched across the medieval night. It was a world without certainty, a world where safety was as fragile as a candle's flame. And from that fear, from that deep and ancient need to survive, the castle was born. You must imagine the world as it was then, not the romantic vision of knights and banquets, but a harsher, humbler reality. The early Middle Ages were an age of constant vulnerability. The fall of Rome had left Europe fractured and defenseless. Kingdoms rose and fell with the seasons. Viking ships prowled the northern seas, their long shadows creeping inland through riverways. In the south, Saracen raiders attacked coastal towns. In the east, Magyar horsemen swept across the plains. To live, then, was to live in a state of watchfulness. It was in this climate of uncertainty that the first fortifications took form. Not grand stone castles, but simple earth and timber works known as motte and bailey structures. Picture a mound of earth, the motte, rising from the land, crowned with a wooden tower. Below it, a small enclosed courtyard, the bailey, surrounded by a wooden palisade. Crude, yes, but effective. A lord could retreat into his tower, while villagers sought refuge in the bailey below. A ditch filled with water or sharpened stakes made approach dangerous. These early fortresses were not the symbols of pride we imagine today. They were tools of survival. Built quickly, sometimes in mere weeks, they marked a turning point in the human relationship with fear. No longer would people flee to the forests or mountains when danger came. Instead, they would stand and defend, behind walls they had built themselves. But it was not enough. Wood burned, earth crumbled. A single spark could turn a castle into an inferno. The lords of the 11th century soon realized that true safety required something more enduring, something that could outlast both time and fire. And so began the great transformation from timber to stone. The shift was not immediate nor simple. Stone demanded skill, stonemasons, architects, laborers. It demanded wealth, organization, and patience. But the results were magnificent. Across Europe, the landscape began to change. Where once stood wooden towers, now rose stone keeps, massive, square fortresses, with walls thicker than a man's height. The most famous of these was the White Tower of London, begun by William the Conqueror around 1078. Its cold limestone walls were not only a symbol of power, but of permanence, a message carved in stone. This land is held and will be held forever. These early stone keeps were marvels of practicality. Narrow windows prevented arrows from entering, but allowed defenders to shoot out. Spiral staircases turned clockwise, so that right-handed attackers climbing upward would struggle to swing their swords. Every design, every detail was deliberate. Even the toilets, small stone chambers projecting from walls, known as garderobes, were placed to drop waste into the moat, keeping disease from spreading within. But inside, however, life was far from comfortable. The great halls were cold, smoky, and dimly lit. Fires burned in central hearths, but smoke drifted lazily toward small roof vents. Rushes strewn across the floors soaked up spilled ale and grease until they turned sour. Yet for all their discomfort, these halls were centers of power, where justice was dispensed, alliances forged, and feasts celebrated. The walls may have been rough and cold, but they contained the heartbeat of a new social order.
As the centuries turned, the genius of medieval builders evolved. No longer content with simple keeps, they began to design entire fortresses as living systems, machines of defense and habitation. Castles became complex networks of walls, towers, courtyards, and hidden passages. The curtain wall surrounded the inner keep like a protective shell. Towers were placed at intervals along the wall, their shapes carefully chosen. Round towers were stronger, deflecting blows from siege engines, while square towers allowed easier construction. Every feature had purpose. The moat, for instance, was not merely water. Sometimes it was dry, filled with sharpened stakes or rubble. The drawbridge and portcullis worked in tandem to control entry, while the murder holes above the gate allowed defenders to rain stones, boiling oil or sand upon intruders. Even the approach road to the gate was designed to turn sharply, forcing attackers to expose their weaker sides as they advanced. The genius of castle design lay in this marriage of practicality and imagination. Builders thought not only in stone, but in time, predicting how an enemy would move, where he would strike, how fear itself might guide his actions. The best castles were not fortresses of brute strength, but of psychological warfare. They were built to intimidate as much as to defend. To see the towering walls of Conwy, Carnarvon, or Bodiam was to feel the weight of authority pressing upon the landscape itself. Yet, even the strongest walls could not stand without the human hands that built them. Thousands of laborers, often peasants or skilled masons, worked from dawn to dusk, shaping the stones, mixing the lime, hauling timber, and setting scaffolds. Many died in accidents or from exhaustion. Their names were rarely recorded, yet their fingerprints remain in the very mortar of Europe's history. You can still see it if you visit an old ruin. The uneven joints where one mason's work met another's. The faint marks, carved initials, small crosses, or mason symbols left hidden behind the stones. These are not the works of nameless laborers, but of craftsmen who understood that they were building something far greater than themselves. And as castles grew more sophisticated, so did the world around them. Small villages formed in their shadows. Markets, chapels, blacksmiths, and farms sprang up to serve the needs of the garrison and the lord's household. The castle became the heart of the medieval community, a place of refuge in war and administration in peace. It was both fortress and home, prison and palace, the axis around which life revolved. At night, when the torches burned low and the sentries stood watch along the walls, the castle became something almost alive. The sound of the wind against the battlements, the creak of wooden beams, the echo of boots in stone corridors, all combined into a kind of slow, rhythmic music. It was the heartbeat of the Middle Ages. In the great silence of night, one could almost feel the presence of all who had passed through those halls. Knights in gleaming armor, servants carrying bread and ale, masons chipping at blocks of limestone, and prisoners whispering prayers to unseen gods. Each stone, each shadow carried memory. The genius of medieval castles was not simply that they could withstand attack, but that they embodied the very essence of the age: fear, faith, ambition, and endurance, all carved into stone. They were, in their way, the medieval age made solid. And yet one question lingers. When those first great keeps rose above the landscape, did their builders truly believe they could last forever? Or did they, even then, sense that time would eventually turn their fortresses into ruins, their genius into memory?
As we journey deeper into the stone heart of the medieval world, it becomes clear that these castles were far more than piles of rock and mortar. They were living systems of logic, mathematics disguised as architecture, defense disguised as beauty. Every stone, every arch, every curve carried a secret purpose. To understand them is to glimpse the quiet genius that shaped an entire age. If you were to stand today before one of the great fortresses, perhaps Chateau Gaillard in Normandy or Beaumaris Castle in Wales, you might at first notice the grandeur, the sheer immensity of the walls. But look closer, and you would begin to see the hidden language written in their design. The masons and engineers of the Middle Ages were not scholars of modern science, yet they possessed a deep, instinctive understanding of geometry, weight, and balance. Take, for example, the arch. It was the most revolutionary shape of the medieval world, deceptively simple, endlessly powerful. Where a flat lintel would collapse under the weight of stone above it, the arch transformed downward pressure into graceful curves of support. It distributed weight evenly into the side pillars, allowing builders to construct doorways, bridges, and vaulted ceilings of astonishing strength. The Gothic arch, with its pointed top, was an even more elegant innovation. It directed the weight more efficiently, allowing for taller, thinner walls and larger windows. Though we associate it mostly with cathedrals, its principles were also applied in castles, especially in later centuries, when architecture became both science and an art. Inside these fortresses, another marvel awaited: the vault. A ceiling of stone curved into sweeping ribs or domes. Vaults allowed rooms to span wide spaces without timber beams, making them more fireproof and durable. In the echoing great halls of castles like Chepstow or Kenilworth, these stone ceilings still stand, defying gravity after 7 centuries. But behind the elegance lay an unending calculation of force. Builders learned through trial, failure, and centuries of observation. They watched where walls cracked and stones shifted. They adapted their designs, thickening certain corners, angling walls to deflect siege engines, carving channels for rainwater to prevent erosion. The medieval builder was both artist and scientist long before those titles were ever separated. Consider also the layout of a castle. The plan was never random. Every approach, every path through the gates was a deliberate puzzle designed to slow and expose attackers. A good castle forced its enemies to reveal themselves, to turn awkwardly, to face uphill, to funnel into narrow corridors. The concentric castle design, introduced in the 13th century, perfected this art. Concentric castles were fortresses within fortresses. Imagine rings of stone, outer walls, inner walls, and finally the keep at the center. Each layer could be defended even if the previous one fell. The walls rose at different heights, allowing archers from the inner levels to shoot over their comrades in front. It was a geometry of survival, a harmony of angles and lines. The genius of these designs lay not only in their military efficiency, but in their adaptability. Every castle was shaped by its landscape. Builders studied the hills, rivers, and prevailing winds. If a castle stood atop a cliff, its walls were angled to prevent stones from tumbling onto attackers below. If it guarded a river crossing, its towers faced the water, with arrow slits aligned to strike ships approaching upstream. In mountainous regions like the Alps or the Pyrenees, builders learned to carve their castles directly from the rock itself. In the lowlands of England and France, they relied on imported limestone, transported on slow barges along medieval canals. Every stone placed was the result of long physical labor and careful planning. And then there were the materials, the invisible foundation of all this endurance. Medieval masons were masters of local stone. They understood which types fractured cleanly, which resisted frost, which absorbed moisture. In southern Europe, they used sandstone and limestone. In the north, granite and basalt. Some castles even combined several materials for strength and color, layering dark and light stones in rhythmic bands. The mortar, often overlooked, was a science of its own. Lime mortar, made by burning limestone, mixing it with water and sand, and allowing it to slake, was essential. The masons knew by touch when it was right. Too wet, and the wall would never set. Too dry, and the joints would crumble. They sometimes mixed horsehair, straw, or even crushed shells to improve texture and grip. Over time, these methods grew so refined that some castles seemed to have fused into their surroundings, stones locked tighter than modern concrete. Many of these structures still stand today, not because of luck, but because their builders understood the subtle chemistry of endurance. Inside the walls, life unfolded in quiet rhythm. The Lord's chamber, the chapel, the kitchen, the storehouse, each space reflected a balance between necessity and defense. The kitchens were often built in circular towers, both to conserve heat and to reduce the risk of fire spreading. The chapels, small and austere, were designed with acoustics in mind. A single chant could echo like a hymn across the stone arches. Even the windows, narrow slits called arrow loops, were feats of precision. They widened on the inside, allowing archers a wide field of fire while keeping the external openings small and difficult to hit. Later, as peace returned to some regions, these slits were enlarged into graceful windows with tracery and stained glass, transforming fortresses into homes. But castles were never truly peaceful. They were, by nature, built for conflict, and every improvement in architecture met an equal improvement in siege warfare. The trebuchet, the siege tower, the battering ram, all forced the castle builder to innovate again. Walls grew thicker. Gatehouses became elaborate traps. The matriculation, a projecting parapet with openings in the floor, allowed defenders to drop stones or boiling liquids straight down onto attackers below. The barbican, an outer fortification, turned the entrance into a maze of death. And yet with all these defenses, castles rarely fell by storm. More often, they fell by time. Sieges could last months or even years. The true enemy was hunger. Thus, another layer of genius appeared, the management of resources. Wells were dug deep within the walls to ensure water. Storerooms were filled with salted meat, grains, and barrels of ale. Pigeons, rabbits, and goats were sometimes kept within the courtyard to provide fresh food. These systems of endurance reveal something profound: the medieval mind's obsession with preparedness. Every detail, from the placement of the well to the thickness of the door hinges, was chosen to withstand not only war, but time itself. But what makes these structures truly astonishing is that they were built without blueprints as we know them today. There were no printed plans, no mathematical instruments beyond the compass, string, and measuring rod. The knowledge existed entirely in the minds and hands of master masons. They worked by proportion, intuition, and centuries of inherited wisdom. A master mason could read a wall like a manuscript. He could see where a crack might form, where a vault might sag. His apprentices learned not through books, but through observation, listening to the ring of the chisel, watching how dust fell from a cut stone. When a master mason set down his chisel, did he truly believe his work would last 1,000 years? Or did he too know that one day the ivy would climb the walls, the fires would die, and his masterpiece would crumble into silence?
If you could step into a medieval castle at dawn, before the echo of footsteps filled its courtyards and the sound of life stirred the cold air, you would first notice the silence. It was a dense, almost physical quiet, the kind that clung to stone and lingered in the chill. A faint trail of smoke might curl upward from a kitchen chimney, the first sign that the day had begun. Somewhere deep inside, a servant might be stoking the embers left from the night before, coaxing the fire back to life. Castles, for all their grandeur, were not the gleaming palaces that romantic stories often paint them to be. They were working machines,
cold, smoky, crowded, and constantly alive with the sound of survival. They were cities in miniature, self-contained worlds built to endure both siege and solitude. At the heart of it all was rhythm, the rhythm of medieval life. Every hour was governed by routine, by necessity, and by the fragile balance between order and unpredictability. The castle never slept completely. Someone was always awake, always working, always guarding. Before the sun even crested the horizon, the castle's servants began their labor. The scullions and kitchen maids moved quietly through shadowed halls, carrying buckets of water from the well. Their breath rose like fog as they hurried through the cold. They would scrub, sweep, and fetch before the lord or lady stirred from their chambers. The kitchen was among the first places to wake fully. It was a vast, cavernous space, sometimes built in a separate tower to prevent fires spreading to the main hall. The smell of smoke and wood filled the air as cooks began preparing the day's meals. Bread was the foundation of every meal, baked in stone ovens, heated by firewood gathered from the castle's forests. The oven would have to burn for hours before it reached the right temperature, and so the bakers began their work before dawn. Water was drawn by hand, every bucket carried through long, cold corridors. It was precious and heavy. Wells were vital, often dug deep into the bedrock to ensure clean water, even during siege. In winter, water froze in buckets and cracks spread along the walls, forcing servants to break the ice just to wash dishes or cook. The great hall, once warmed, became the center of life. It was not just a dining room, but a gathering space, courtroom, and theater of power. In smaller castles, it doubled as sleeping space for guards or guests. Torches burned along the walls, their light flickering over tapestries that depicted battles, saints, or heraldic beasts. The smell of burning tallow and smoke was constant. The medieval world never escaped its fires. By mid-morning, the castle stirred to full life. The lord and lady, if resident, would appear. Their morning began not with luxury, but ritual. The lady's attendants would bring basins of warm water and fine linen towels for washing, followed by layers of clothing, linen, wool, fur. The lord would meet his steward to hear reports from the estate, crops, rents, disputes, and preparations for any upcoming journey or defense. In those hours, the castle was an office of governance. Messengers came and went, boots echoing on stone. The clerk might sit in a corner of the hall, scratching out letters in Latin on parchment with a quill, sealing them with wax and the lord's crest. Meanwhile, in the courtyard below, the blacksmith's hammer rang steadily. He mended horseshoes, tools, and weapons alike. The smell of iron and smoke mixed with that of hay and manure from the stables. The air was thick, heavy, full of work. Every sound had its place, the clang of armor being polished, the whine of the wind through arrow slits, the low murmur of servants speaking in the dialect of the region, a language often different from that of their masters. The castle's guards trained in the yard, running drills with wooden swords or real steel dulled for practice. The archers stood before straw targets, their arrows thudding into place, one after another, in rhythmic bursts. Their routine was endless, for though the castle's walls were strong, the men who guarded them had to be stronger still. Yet for all its power and hierarchy, the castle was never immune to discomfort. In winter, the cold invaded every room. The walls, even several feet thick, could not keep it out. Fires gave warmth only to those near them. The corners of rooms stayed frozen, sometimes with frost creeping up from the floors. People slept under layers of wool and fur, their breath misting in the air. Smoke often filled the rooms, for chimneys were primitive and drafts poor. It was said that in some great halls a man could barely see across the room when the fire was high. The scent of smoke was in everything, in food, in fabric, in hair. Even in summer, the stones stayed cool. The air inside a castle never quite matched the world outside. It was a place both of safety and confinement, protection and isolation. And so life unfolded within those walls, bound by duty and the slow passing of days. In the afternoon, the castle settled into its daily rhythm again. The steward would make his rounds, checking supplies, counting barrels, inspecting stores of salt meat and grain. In some castles, there were gardens within the walls, small patches of herbs and vegetables tended by kitchen workers or monks. The chapel was another constant presence. Its bell marked the hours of prayer, calling the household to moments of reflection. Services were simple, the chants echoing beautifully in the stone chamber. Even those who could not read or write knew these sounds by heart. Religion in the medieval world was not a matter of choice, but of rhythm, a cycle that shaped every hour. At dusk, the castle shifted again. Candles were lit, and the long tables in the great hall were prepared for the evening meal. The food was placed on wooden platters, sometimes pewter for wealthier households. Wine or ale was poured into cups. Servants stood by, ready to refill and remove plates. The meal itself was more than nourishment. It was ceremony. The lord and lady sat upon raised chairs at one end of the hall, slightly elevated to see all before them. Below sat knights, retainers, and guests, arranged by rank. At the lower tables, servants and guards ate quickly and quietly. The food was shared in order, the finest cuts for the high table, the leftovers passed down to the lower ranks. The castle's dogs roamed freely, snapping up scraps that fell to the floor. Minstrels sometimes played, reciting ballads or stories. In wealthier households, jesters or storytellers entertained the company. But in smaller castles, conversation itself was the only music. Slow, deliberate talk about trade, harvests, and local rumors. When the fire burned low, the castle dimmed again. Candles were snuffed out, one by one. Servants carried torches as they made final rounds, checking the gates, securing the doors, and ensuring no fire burned unattended. And then came the quiet again, that deep, ancient stillness that filled every medieval night. Outside the walls, the wind moved across the moors or forests, carrying the cry of an owl or the distant bark of a dog. Inside, the sound of snoring, the crackle of dying embers, and the faint rustle of rats in the corners were the only reminders of life. In the Lord's chamber, the bed stood high above the floor, layered with blankets and furs. Curtains surrounded it, not for vanity, but warmth. The smell of smoke and wool lingered even here. The guards changed shifts, stamping their feet to stay warm on the parapets. The moonlight glimmered on the stone, casting long shadows across the battlements. It was in these moments, when the castle slept, that one could truly sense its genius. Not just the strength of its walls, but the way those walls enclosed an entire world, a world where every movement, every habit, every sound was shaped by stone and silence. Life inside a castle was not romantic. It was survival, shaped into routine, endurance turned into rhythm. Every meal, every fire, every prayer was a quiet rebellion against time, cold, and decay. Yet there was beauty in this monotony, a strange harmony in how humanity adapted to confinement.
The deeper you peer into the life of a medieval castle, the more you begin to understand that its brilliance was not only in its walls, towers, or moats, but in its people. Every stone was set by hand, every chamber maintained by someone whose name history rarely bothered to remember. It was not kings or knights who made castles function. It was the unspoken rhythm of hundreds of hands working in silent harmony, day after day, year after year. If you stood in the courtyard at dawn and watched the first flickers of life emerge, you might notice how invisible most of that labor was. The castle's lord might appear briefly in the great hall, but it was the cooks, maids, porters, smiths, falconers, carpenters, and watchmen who truly kept the place alive. Each had a defined role, and yet in the quiet machinery of castle life, every role overlapped. The castle steward, usually a man of learning and discipline, oversaw it all. He carried a ring of keys at his belt, a symbol of authority and trust. His duty was to ensure that stores were stocked, that the servants were fed, and that nothing, not even a missing candle or loaf of bread, went unaccounted for. In an age when scarcity could mean starvation, his precision kept order. Below him, the bailiff managed the estate lands, ensuring the fields surrounding the castle were plowed, the tenants paid their dues, and the barns were full before winter. His was a hard, thankless task, balancing loyalty to his lord with the resentment of peasants who toiled for another's profit. Then there were the kitchen workers, perhaps the busiest of all. The medieval kitchen was an orchestra of smoke, heat, and haste. Cooks roasted meat over open flames, turning spits by hand for hours. Cauldrons of pottage, thick stews made from barley, beans, herbs, and salted meat, bubbled endlessly. Everything was reused. Bread crusts were dried and turned into thickeners. Bones became stock. Even the fat skimmed from boiled meats was rendered into tallow for candles or soap. Waste was unthinkable. It is easy to imagine the grandeur of feasts in the great hall, the platters of roasted game, the flagons of wine, the laughter echoing from stone walls. But what went unseen were the people behind that spectacle. The scullions, often young boys who scrubbed greasy pots with handfuls of sand, the turnbroaches, who sweated by the fire, turning spits until their arms ached, the butlers, who managed the buttery, keeping ale and wine secure and ensuring none was stolen. Every movement within the castle was a system of checks and balances, not of government, but of survival. The laundresses worked in a cold, damp chamber near the well, washing linen by hand. They boiled water in cauldrons, beat the clothes with wooden paddles, then hung them in courtyards to dry, stiff with frost and winter. Their hands were cracked and raw, yet their work was essential. Clean linen was not merely a comfort, it was a defense against lice, disease, and discomfort in an age before soap was common. Elsewhere, the carpenters and masons repaired what time and weather wore down. Wood rotted, hinges rusted, and walls cracked with frost. Every day was maintenance. A castle was never truly finished. Even after decades of use, there was always something that needed mending. A roof to patch, a door to hang, a stair to smooth. The armorer's workshop smelled of oil and metal. There, chainmail was repaired link by link, helmets polished, and swords sharpened. Armor was not just for battle. It was an investment, often worth more than a year's wage for a common man. Keeping it pristine was both practical and symbolic, for a knight's gleaming steel reflected not only light, but honor. And then there were the falconers, men of unusual rank within the household, who trained birds of prey for hunting. Their work was a delicate craft, blending patience, precision, and quiet authority. The sight of a falcon returning to its master's glove was more than sport. It was status, a demonstration of mastery over nature itself. But beneath this hierarchy lay another layer of life,
the servants and villains who came and went through the postern gates unseen by nobility. They fetched water, gathered herbs, tended livestock, or carried messages to nearby villages. They were not bound by glory, but by necessity. Every castle had its children too, sons of knights in training, squires learning to serve, and daughters of nobles learning to stitch, sing, and read scripture. The boys' days were filled with drills, lessons, and small humiliations, for every squire was bound to his master's service until he proved himself worthy of knighthood. The girls, meanwhile, learned the arts of running a household, managing servants, understanding accounts, and keeping order within the domestic world. The chaplain offered spiritual guidance to all, though few could truly understand the Latin of his prayers. His chapel was small, cold, and dimly lit, yet it stood as the heart of the castle's moral rhythm. Bells marked the hours of devotion, dividing the day into sacred segments: matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and compline. The chant of voices, low and steady, carried through the corridors like a heartbeat. In the evening, when the great hall emptied and torches burned low, a quieter labor continued, one of record-keeping and calculation. The clerk or scribe sat by candlelight, copying letters, drawing up inventories, and recording transactions. His quill scratched rhythmically against the parchment, each letter deliberate and slow. Ink was precious, mistakes were costly. These quiet hours of writing preserved the castle's very memory, every transaction, every order, every debt owed and repaid. Yet for all this structure, life inside the castle was never static. There were moments of fear, whispers of approaching raiders, rumors of rebellion or disease creeping through the countryside. When threat loomed, everything changed. The gates were shut, supplies were counted, the drawbridge raised. The smith worked longer hours, the guards doubled their shifts. The castle became what it was truly designed to be, a fortress of endurance. Inside, the servants carried on their routines even as tension thickened the air. Food was rationed, fires were controlled to preserve fuel. In those moments, the genius of the castle's design revealed itself most clearly. Every feature, the thick walls, narrow windows, deep wells, and hidden passageways, had been conceived with siege in mind. The walls held not only people, but a philosophy that survival was the highest form of order. When peace returned, it was often slow, cautious. Life crept back like light after a long winter. The gates opened, markets resumed, repairs began again. The castle was always healing from its own endurance. And through all this, the hierarchy persisted, the unspoken web that held every person in place. At the top, the lord and lady, beneath them the steward and officials, below them the skilled artisans and retainers, and at the base the servants and laborers. Each depended on the other, even if they never met as equals. It was an order as old as stone itself, rigid but stable, a kind of social architecture mirroring the castle's physical form. If one looks closely, one might see that the true genius of the medieval castle was not in its battlements or towers, but in how it managed to sustain so many different lives within such confined walls, lives intertwined, layered, and utterly interdependent. And in the silence of night, when the fires burned low and the hall stood empty, the echoes of that interdependence lingered in the air. The whisper of a broom, the clink of a chain, the sigh of wind through arrow slits. It was, in its own way, a living organism, breathing through its people, held together by faith, labor, and endurance. And so we begin to see that medieval genius was not merely about defense or war. It was about adaptation, the human capacity to survive within stone, to find warmth in coldness and meaning in monotony. But the question remains, how did such a world evolve from simple wooden fortifications into these vast, intricate systems of stone, power, and symbolism?
You must imagine the world before castles, before the stone giants rose upon the hills. It was a world of vulnerability, of open plains and scattered villages, of wooden walls that creaked under the weight of fear. Europe in the early Middle Ages was a place of shifting power and deep uncertainty. Kingdoms fractured. Raids from Norsemen and other invaders tore through coasts and riverlands. And every noble sought a way to secure not just wealth, but survival. The very first castles were not what you think of when you picture stone towers or massive keeps. They were humble and almost primitive in design. The motte and bailey, the original blueprint for Europe's fortresses, began not as grandeur, but as desperation. A motte was a raised mound of earth, either man-made or natural, upon which a wooden tower stood. Around its base, the bailey, a walled courtyard, contained all that sustained life: huts, stables, storehouses, and workshops. The entire structure was surrounded by a ditch or a palisade, often dug by peasants who were promised protection in exchange for their labor. These early fortifications appeared first in France in the 10th century, during the time of the Normans. The genius of the motte and bailey lay not in its beauty, but in its speed. A lord could raise one in a matter of weeks, using timber, soil, and sweat. The mound gave height, a view of the surrounding land, a warning of approaching enemies. The wooden tower gave command. The ditch provided the illusion of depth and defense. It was simple, yet effective enough to deter small raiding bands. But wood burns, and it rots. The greatest weakness of these early castles was their impermanence. After a few seasons of rain and frost, the wooden stakes would decay, the walls would sag, and the motte itself would erode. When fire came, as it so often did during sieges, it devoured everything. It was the Norman conquest of England in 1066 that truly changed the face of castle building. When William, Duke of Normandy, defeated Harold at Hastings, he brought with him more than an army. He brought a new architectural revolution. Within months of his victory, motte and bailey castles began to sprout across England like seeds sown in conquered soil. Hastings, Pevensey, Dover, one by one they appeared. Each was a symbol of Norman control, a message carved into the landscape that said, "You are ruled from above now." But William's successors soon realized that timber was not enough. The English countryside was wet, windswept, and prone to rot. So by the early 12th century, the wooden towers began to be replaced by stone keeps, vast, square fortresses of limestone and granite, some so thick-walled that they could withstand generations of siege. One of the earliest and most famous examples was the White Tower in London, the heart of what is now known as the Tower of London. It was built under the direction of Gundulf, a Norman bishop and skilled architect who understood both the sacred geometry of church design and the brutal practicality of military defense. Standing 40 feet high with walls up to 15 feet thick, the White Tower was both home and fortress, chapel and command post. Its windows were narrow, its chambers cold, but its very presence projected a power that transcended its materials. It was a symbol of authority, endurance, and surveillance. As decades passed, the design of castles evolved. Architects began to learn from experience, from each siege, each collapse, each adaptation. The square keep, though strong, had weaknesses. Its corners were points of vulnerability. If attackers could undermine one, the entire wall might crumble. Thus emerged the cylindrical tower, smooth and round,
deflecting both arrows and catapult stones. This marked the beginning of the 12th century revolution in castle architecture. The transition from the early feudal fortresses to the refined and complex stone citadels of the later Middle Ages. The change was not only architectural, it was philosophical. Where once the castle had been a crude shelter for a local lord, it became an instrument of statecraft, a fusion of military strategy, artistry, and administration. The engineers of these castles were not mere builders. They were mathematicians, astronomers, and craftsmen. Many were monks trained in the monasteries, familiar with the geometry of cathedrals. They brought that same divine sense of proportion to the architecture of war. Each castle became a microcosm of order, a reflection of the cosmos itself. If you study the layout of a typical 12th century concentric castle, you will notice how meticulously it was planned. The outer wall, the curtain wall, encircled a series of inner wards, each layer higher and stronger than the last. At every turn, attackers would face new obstacles. Murder holes above gates, arrow slits angled for maximum defense, and battlements that allowed archers to shoot while remaining shielded. These defenses were not random. They were rooted in deep observation. How soldiers moved, how wind affected arrows, how sunlight could blind attackers in certain directions. They thought of everything. The gatehouse became the nerve center of this defensive system. Once a simple wooden door, it evolved into an architectural marvel. A stone tunnel reinforced with portcullises, drawbridges, and iron-studded doors. Inside, guards could trap invaders between two gates, a killing zone, where arrows and boiling oil could be poured from above. It sounds brutal, but to those who designed it, this was not cruelty. It was precision. The application of human intellect to the chaos of conflict. And yet castles were not merely instruments of war. They were also instruments of status. The lord's chamber grew more comfortable, adorned with tapestries, glazed windows, and carved stone fireplaces. The lady's solar, a private room for embroidery and reading, was a quiet space of domestic grace amid the cold geometry of stone. The chapel was richly decorated, reminding all who entered that even within walls of war, the soul still needed sanctuary. From the 12th century onwards, another figure began to appear in the history of castle building: the master mason. Unlike earlier builders, who worked anonymously, these men began to achieve recognition for their skill. They traveled from site to site, carrying not only tools, but knowledge of proportions, load-bearing techniques, and innovations learned from one project to another. They used simple yet ingenious instruments: the plumb line for vertical accuracy, the mason's square for right angles, and the compass for perfect circles. Geometry became their language, and through it, they communicated ideas across time and borders. One could say that the real genius of medieval castles was the marriage of science and superstition. Every castle was both a calculation and a prayer. Builders invoked divine protection for their work, carving crosses into the foundation before the first stone was laid. The placement of towers was not only strategic, but symbolic. Some aligned with sunrise on feast days, others with constellations believed to hold power. There is evidence, too, of masons leaving hidden marks, geometric symbols carved discreetly into the stones. These masons' marks were both signatures and blessings, reminders that even in labor meant for war, human pride and hope endured. Imagine standing in the courtyard of a nearly finished castle. You would hear the chisel's steady rhythm against stone, the call of foremen, the creak of cranes hauling heavy blocks into place. Dust hung in the air. The scent of lime mortar clung to everything. Each wall was layered not just with stone, but with generations of thought. Each arch represented an experiment, an attempt to reach perfection through endurance and repetition. And when, finally, the Lord took residence, what he saw as glory was the product of thousands of invisible minds. The castle's strength, its harmony, its endurance, none of it came from him. It came from the quiet persistence of builders who never saw their names recorded.
The castle, by the 13th century, had transcended its original purpose. It was no longer merely a bastion against attack. It had become a world unto itself. Inside its thick walls, society was not just protected, it was organized, structured, and performed. The medieval castle was a machine for living, governing, and symbolizing power. As you picture one, imagine stepping across the drawbridge in the pale morning light. The air is cool and smells faintly of wet stone and smoke from the night's dying fires. You would pass under the portcullis, the heavy iron grid above your head, and enter into the outer bailey, the living core of the castle. Here the life of the estate unfolded like a slow, rhythmic dance. Blacksmiths worked beside their forges, the sound of hammering echoing against the walls. Grooms tended horses in the stables. Servants swept the cobbled yards, while washerwomen scrubbed clothes in wooden troughs, the smell of lye sharp in the air. Pigs rooted in corners, hens fluttered across the straw, and above it all loomed the keep, that monumental center of authority and refuge. Every sound, every movement was part of a delicate order. Nothing existed without purpose. The castle was an ecosystem, its survival dependent on balance between defense and domestic life, fear and faith, work and worship. The Great Hall was the heart of it all. It was both a stage and a statement, the physical embodiment of the Lord's power. Picture it, a long chamber lined with stone, tapestries draped on the walls to soften the cold, and a great hearth blazing in the center, its smoke trailing toward a narrow vent high above. Wooden tables ran the length of the hall, and at the far end stood the high table, raised upon a dais where the lord and lady sat. Here law was spoken, disputes settled, oaths sworn. The great hall was where feasts unfolded under the flicker of candlelight, where minstrels sang of battles past, and where every action was a subtle reinforcement of hierarchy. The servants ate below, the retainers above them, and the nobility presiding at the head, a literal architecture of rank and privilege. At the edge of the hall, carved stone doorways led to the solar, the chapel, and the kitchens, each a small world of its own. The kitchens, especially, were feats of medieval engineering. Fires burned day and night, their heat channeled through carefully constructed flues to avoid smoke suffocating the servants. Stone sinks drained water through lead pipes, and meat was hung in cool chambers where thick walls trapped the chill. The kitchens were noisy, hot, and chaotic. Yet, in their way, they were as important to the functioning of the castle as any battlement or drawbridge. The chapel, in contrast, was a space of quiet order and divine geometry. It was always aligned east to west, with the altar facing the sunrise, a symbolic gesture toward the promise of resurrection. Even the smallest castles had chapels, for the rhythm of medieval life was guided by the bell's toll and the turning of the liturgical calendar. Faith was not decoration, it was the mortar
that held society together. Within these walls, hundreds of people might live, from the noble family to knights, soldiers, cooks, grooms, masons, and scribes. Yet the castle was not democratic. Every life within it moved to the will of one, the Lord. The Lord's authority was absolute, yet his power depended entirely on perception. The genius of medieval castle design lay partly in this, the way architecture became theater. The height of towers, the echo of footsteps in stone halls, the sequence of courtyards, all of it worked to project control and majesty. When a visiting baron approached, the path through the castle was deliberately choreographed. The visitor would pass beneath looming walls, across drawbridges that could be raised, through gates reinforced with iron. Each turn of the path revealed the keep rising higher, until by the time he stood before the Lord in the great hall, the message was clear. You are within his power now. But beyond the drama of hierarchy, castles were also centers of administration. Inside the keep, clerks hunched over wooden desks, scratching quills across parchment. Ledgers recorded rents, harvest yields, and tithes. Scrolls sealed with wax contained the contracts and decrees that kept the local economy turning. In a world where literacy was rare, the written word was another kind of fortress, a defense against dispute, a tool of continuity. Each parchment represented something profoundly human, an attempt to impose order on the unpredictable. The seasons changed, harvests failed, wars came and went, but within the cool stone chambers of the castle, lines of ink promised stability. Outside, the villagers, those who worked the Lord's lands, saw the castle as both protector and oppressor. To them, it was a distant, almost sacred structure. Its walls symbolized safety, yet they also reminded them of their place. When danger came, raiders, bandits, or rival lords, peasants fled to the castle gates. And yet when peace returned, they returned to the fields, still bound to the very power that enclosed them. You see, castles were never isolated structures. They were part of a living network, political, economic, and spiritual. Across Europe, from Scotland to Sicily, they formed the backbone of feudal society. Each one watched over a landscape carved into manors, clusters of fields, mills, and hamlets. The castle was the administrative heart of this system. It stored grain in its cellars, protected its tenants during sieges, and enforced the laws of its realm. The Lord's seal, stamped in wax, marked with his crest, was as binding as a royal decree. But even the strongest stone could not endure without maintenance. Masons constantly repaired walls, carpenters replaced rotting beams, blacksmiths reforged the hinges of great gates. The upkeep of a castle was an endless act of preservation, a daily defiance against time, weather, and decay. As centuries passed, these structures grew ever more complex. In the 13th and 14th centuries, the rise of concentric castles marked the height of medieval engineering. Places like Beaumaris, Harlech, and Caerphilly in Wales displayed a level of mathematical sophistication that still astonishes modern architects. Their walls were built in perfect symmetry, outer walls lower but thicker, inner walls higher and narrower, creating interlocking lines of defense. Each gatehouse was a fortress in itself, with multiple portcullises, arrow loops, and murder holes. The corners of towers were positioned so that every approach could be covered by crossfire. This was genius born not from peace, but from the anticipation of war. Yet even in their martial perfection, there was beauty, the geometry of power expressed in stone. When night fell on these castles, the world within quieted. Fires burned low. The sounds of hammers and hooves gave way to the murmur of distant conversation, the sigh of wind through arrow slits, and the slow drip of water down stone channels. The keep, once a place of command, became a sleeping house. The heartbeat of a fortress turned inward. The lord and lady would retire to their chambers, lofty rooms lined with tapestries to hold in warmth. Beneath them, servants slept on straw pallets. Guards took shifts on the battlements, their cloaks pulled tight against the cold. The torches flickered, casting long shadows that danced upon the walls. And in that stillness, one might sense the paradox at the heart of all medieval castles, that these fortresses, designed to dominate the world outside, were also places of deep introspection and isolation. Inside those walls, surrounded by all the weight of stone and power, a person could feel utterly alone. The genius of these constructions lay not only in their ability to repel armies, but in how they shaped the psychology of those who lived within them. Every arch, every stairwell, every echo reinforced a hierarchy of space and thought. The chapel for the spirit, the hall for authority, the battlements for vigilance, all in their way kept life ordered, structured, controlled. By the late Middle Ages, the meaning of castles began to shift once again.
By the dawn of the 15th century, the sound of hammer on anvil had quieted in the great castle yards of Europe. The winds of war had changed, and with them, the destiny of the stone giants that once dominated every hill and valley. Where once masons labored day and night to raise towers and battlements, now moss crept over the mortar. The fires in the forges dimmed, and the songs of soldiers gave way to the slow sigh of decay. The genius of medieval castle design, that intricate marriage of defense and daily life, was beginning to fade into memory. New inventions, new philosophies, and new weapons had begun to unravel the very logic upon which the castle was built. The first enemy was not rebellion or siege, but gunpowder. The thunder of cannon shattered more than walls. It shattered centuries of architectural certainty. A single cannon could do in minutes what once required weeks of siege. Walls that had once seemed eternal began to crumble like clay. Engineers and lords tried to adapt. They thickened their walls, lowered their towers, and reshaped fortresses into star-like bastions surrounded by sloped earthworks. But something essential was lost. The castle, as the medieval mind had known it, was no longer a living organism. It was evolving into something colder, more mathematical, less human. And as cannons roared across France, England, and the Holy Roman Empire, the world that the castles represented, the feudal order itself, was dissolving. Knights who once swore loyalty to their lords found themselves replaced by mercenary armies, soldiers who fought not for honor or land, but for coin. The personal bond between ruler and retainer, symbolized by the drawbridge and the oath, was giving way to bureaucracy, contracts, and strategy. In that shift, castles began to lose their meaning. Imagine for a moment a castle in decline. The year is 1487. The banners that once flew from its towers are tattered. The courtyard that once thrummed with life is empty except for a few chickens scratching at the mud. The forge is cold, the stables echo with the wind. The great gatehouse, once a marvel of engineering, hangs crooked on rusted hinges. Inside, the great hall stands silent. The tapestries sag under the weight of dust. The long tables have been cleared away.
their wood gnawed by worms. The Lord's chair, once a throne of judgment and feasts, is now abandoned, tilted slightly where a leg has rotted through. Only the echoes remain. Every corner of the castle seems haunted by memory. You can almost hear the ghost of laughter by the hearth, the echo of boots on stone, the soft murmur of a priest's prayer. The castle breathes still, but shallowly, like a dying creature clinging to its last warmth. The great families of Europe turned toward comfort and aesthetics. They abandoned their cold, defensive fortresses for manor houses and palaces. Where castles had been built to repel, the new architecture invited. Large windows, ornamental gardens, polished marble instead of soot-stained stone. The age of iron portcullises was giving way to the age of glass. But time, it seems, has a kind of tenderness. Even as these once mighty fortresses fell into ruin, their bones remained beautiful. Their symmetry, their strength, and their scars began to speak a different language, one of nostalgia, not conquest. Travelers and poets who wandered through the countryside began to see in them not the symbols of tyranny or war, but monuments to endurance, to artistry, to the passage of ages. By the 17th and 18th centuries, artists and philosophers began to rediscover these ruins. They painted them as the melancholic relics of a nobler age. Ivy crawled over their broken walls like green lace. Rain pooled in the empty courtyards, and flocks of crows nested where once banners flew. And yet, under that melancholy, there was still genius. Because the castle, even in ruin, remained a masterpiece of human intention. The way its stones locked together, the way its towers still cast long shadows at sunset, the way its doorways framed the horizon, all spoke of the deep intelligence and care of its builders. A ruin is not a corpse. It is a memory that refuses to die. Travelers described sleeping within half-collapsed halls, the firelight flickering across carvings made centuries before. They said that when the wind passed through the arrow slits, it moaned like the whispers of forgotten nights. They said the stones themselves held voices, that if you listened closely, you could hear the rhythm of the mason's chisels echoing faintly through time. And perhaps they were right. For even as Europe modernized, the castle remained lodged in its imagination. The people who no longer needed fortresses still longed for their permanence. In the chaos of new wars and revolutions, the old towers became symbols of something unbreakable, an anchor in the rushing tide of change. Painters, poets, and composers began to romanticize them. In Germany, they called it Ruinenlust, the love of ruins. In France, they spoke of l'âme des pierres, the soul of stones. Castles became backdrops for tragedies, settings for legends, metaphors for the beauty of decline. A ruined castle under moonlight, its windows hollow, its battlements fractured, could stir more emotion than any pristine palace. The brokenness itself became sacred. And in that transformation, medieval architecture achieved a kind of immortality. Its genius was not only in its construction, but in its capacity to outlive its purpose, to shift from fortress to home, from home to relic, from relic to symbol. Few creations in history have endured such a metamorphosis. When you walk through those ruins today, perhaps in Wales or Normandy or the Scottish Highlands, you are not simply walking through the remains of war. You are walking through the echo of human intention. Each stone laid by a mason's hand centuries ago still does what it was meant to: stand against time. And in that way, the genius of medieval castle design endures. Its purpose may have changed, but its spirit remains untouched. The torchlight of history has dimmed, yet on those quiet hills the silhouettes of old fortresses still glow faintly under the stars. They are reminders of what humanity once believed: that through stone, sweat, and time, we could make something that would last forever.
The centuries that followed the fall of medieval fortresses were quieter, gentler, and yet somehow more haunting. The castles that had once been alive with fire, armor, and the metallic echo of command now existed as silent landscapes of memory. They became relics that outlasted their makers, monuments not only to power, but to the impermanence of all human ambition. It is strange, isn't it, how the very things that were once built to command fear began to evoke tenderness. By the late 17th and 18th centuries, as Europe embraced reason, science, and the elegant order of the Enlightenment, a new kind of emotion began to stir, a longing for the rough edges of the past. The old fortresses standing broken on lonely hills became something like living ghosts, symbols of lost honor and forgotten dreams. Writers began to visit them, not to measure their defenses, but to measure their silences. They would stand in the midst of an overgrown courtyard, their shoes damp with dew, and imagine the lives that had once passed through those gates. The lords and ladies, the soldiers and servants, the laughter, the arguments, the endless waiting during long winters. Every ruined archway became a doorway into another time. The Romantic poets of the 18th century turned these ruins into cathedrals of memory. Wordsworth wrote of majestic piles of old decay, and Byron wandered through the crumbling walls of Chillon and Newstead, feeling that in ruins there was something purer than perfection. The broken arch was more beautiful than the whole one. The fallen tower told more truth than the standing one. And as their verses spread, the image of the castle began to change again. It was no longer just a ruin of stone. It became a vessel of emotion. It held not just the history of a region, but the yearning of all humanity, the wish to preserve, to endure, to remain. In the quiet of those decayed chambers, people began to hear something. Not the sound of swords, but of time breathing, the slow rhythm of centuries pressing against the present. When you stand in a castle ruin at twilight, there is a weight in the air that is not entirely physical. The stones hum softly with warmth that has outlasted generations. You might run your fingers across the rough wall and feel the fingerprints of those who built it. Each groove, each uneven line, each scar in the stone was made by hands, living, sweating, believing hands that once thought this wall would stand forever. And it has, though not as they imagined. In the 19th century, this fascination grew into a movement. Across Europe, the Gothic revival brought castles back to life, but this time not for defense. They were built to be beautiful, not practical. Architects studied medieval ruins not as engineers, but as dreamers. They borrowed arches, towers, and vaulted ceilings and reimagined them for an age that no longer feared siege. In England, men like Horace Walpole built fantasy castles, most famously Strawberry Hill House, with its delicate tracery and dreamlike halls.
In Germany, King Ludwig II of Bavaria built Neuschwanstein, perhaps the most famous reimagining of medieval design in the modern world. Its towers pierce the clouds, its halls glow like something out of a fairy tale. But while Neuschwanstein was beautiful, it was also an illusion. It was the echo of a lost world, built by a man who could not bear the reality of his own time. Ludwig, known as the Mad King, retreated into that castle not to rule, but to escape. And perhaps that is what all castles became in the end. Not fortresses of power, but fortresses of imagination. In that way, the genius of medieval architecture lived on, not in war, but in dreams. Across the 19th century, castles appeared in paintings, poems, and stories as settings of mystery, romance, and melancholy. They became the homes of ghosts, kings, and forgotten lovers. They symbolized the space between what was and what could never be again. And still, beneath all the art and nostalgia, the original craftsmanship remained. The thick masonry, the spiral staircases, the tiny slits for arrows, all of it endured as quiet proof of an ancient logic. The masons who built them never dreamed of kings like Ludwig or poets like Byron. Yet their work inspired both. That, perhaps, is the true legacy of their genius. Their stones transcended purpose. They became timeless symbols of the human condition. Even today, when you see a castle, whether in ruin or restored, there is a stillness about it that feels unlike anything else. Modern buildings may reach higher, shine brighter, or cover more ground, but they do not possess that quiet gravity. They do not whisper to the past in the same way. Because castles, even in ruin, are alive. They hold the scent of rain in their walls, the cool breath of old fires, the faint echo of hooves across forgotten courtyards. The very air around them seems slower, thicker with memory. You can stand inside a roofless great hall and feel time folding in on itself, centuries compressed into silence. And what of the people who once lived there? The lords, knights, servants, cooks, and children, all gone, yet somehow present in every stone. When you walk those corridors, you are not alone. The floor beneath your feet remembers the weight of every step that ever crossed it. The genius of medieval castle design, then, is not merely architectural, it is existential. It asks a question that humanity has never stopped asking. Can we make something that lasts? Each wall, each arch, each tower was a human answer to that question. And though many have fallen, the idea behind them has not. In every ruined castle, there is still the whisper of that defiance, the human refusal to vanish. And so these ruins did not die. They transformed. They became the keepers of our collective memory, the guardians of everything fragile and enduring in us. Their brokenness made them complete again. As centuries passed, tourists came, painters lingered, and historians wrote. They measured the stones, mapped the towers, and debated the methods of construction. But none could capture the soul of those places, the invisible essence that seeps into the air when sunlight hits old stone. Perhaps that is the true brilliance of medieval design. It does not merely stand, it breathes. It does not merely survive, it changes with us. And as night falls over these ancient ruins, their outlines soften against the dark. The moon slides over the jagged walls, tracing the edges of history. The wind that moves through the arrow slits carries no war cry now, only the sigh of time itself. For centuries, these castles have been sleeping, dreaming of the people who once gave them life. They are no longer fortresses of power, but temples of memory, standing watch over a world that has long since moved on. And perhaps in that sleep, they have found what their builders never could: peace.
There is a certain irony in the fact that the castles which once represented the height of military and political power now stand as the quietest relics of human civilization. Their ramparts no longer echo with the sound of commands, nor do their gates creak open for the arrival of lords and kings. Instead, they open for tourists carrying cameras, children holding hands, and old travelers who come seeking not protection, but meaning. And yet, these silent stones continue to shape the world around you, not merely as ruins or museums, but as ideas that refuse to die. It might surprise you to realize that every skyscraper, every modern fortress of glass and steel that pierces the skyline of your world, carries within it the whisper of a medieval castle. The same instinct that once built keeps, walls, and moats, the desire for safety, for order, for endurance, now hides beneath the polished facades of contemporary cities. Human beings never stopped building fortresses, they only changed the materials. The genius of medieval architecture is that it taught us how to think about space, how to organize life around protection, hierarchy, and permanence. To understand this inheritance, you have to imagine yourself walking through one of these ancient strongholds again. Picture it as dawn breaks. The mist still clings to the towers and dew gathers along the parapets like tiny jewels of breath. Below, the world stirs, the distant sound of a blacksmith, the smell of damp earth, the soft call of doves hidden in crevices of stone. This world may be gone, but its structure lingers everywhere. The concentric layout of the castle, an inner keep surrounded by successive layers of walls, is the ancestor of modern cities, government complexes, and even digital security systems. Every password, every locked file, every firewall echoes the logic of medieval defenses. The masons and engineers of the 12th and 13th centuries may not have understood algorithms or encryption, but they understood layered security. A castle was not simply a wall, it was a philosophy. Never trust one barrier alone. If the enemy breaches the first gate, the second must hold. If the second fails, the keep must stand. In this layered pattern lies the same wisdom that guards your data today. The castle's genius was not brute strength, but resilience through complexity. And yet, beyond strategy and defense, there was something spiritual about these structures. To live inside a castle was to live inside a metaphor. Each chamber represented not only function, but meaning. The great hall was the heart, a place of warmth, light, and community. The chapel was the soul, quiet and introspective. The kitchens were the stomach, endlessly toiling, unseen, yet essential. And the walls themselves were the skin, thick and enduring, keeping the inner life of the castle intact against the cold, chaotic world beyond. In that sense, a castle was almost alive. It breathed through its fires, its wells, its courtyards. The people inside were its blood, flowing, working, repairing, fighting, feasting. When they were gone, the body did not die. It slept. That is why when you visit a ruin today, say the crumbled keep of a Norman fortress in Wales, or the moss-covered stones of a Scottish tower overlooking a loch, there is still a faint pulse beneath your feet. You can almost hear it if you stand still enough, the sound of time beating slowly, patiently, beneath the ground. But what is most extraordinary about these places is not that they survived, but how they did. Many castles were destroyed deliberately, by siege, by neglect, by the slow gnawing of rain and frost, yet something in their design resisted oblivion. Their very weight made them eternal. Even broken, they hold form. Their geometry endures. The arch still curves, the tower still gestures upward, even if half of it has fallen away. This resilience is not accidental. It was born from a medieval understanding of material, stone as both substance and symbol. Medieval builders were not modern engineers, yet they possessed an intuitive relationship with matter. They read the grain of stone the way a musician reads notation.
They knew where to cut, how to lay, and how to balance weight. Their structures, though lacking the mathematics of modern architecture, achieved something far rarer: harmony. You can feel it when you walk beneath a vaulted ceiling. The air moves differently there. Sound lingers longer. It's as if the stones themselves were tuned to a frequency of stillness. This sensitivity to the natural world extended far beyond aesthetics. Medieval castles were sustainable ecosystems long before the term existed. Their courtyards contained wells and gardens. Their kitchens repurposed ash for cleaning, bones for tools, fat for light. Even their waste systems, primitive though they seem, reveal an understanding of gravity, drainage, and natural filtration. A castle was a miniature world, self-contained and self-aware. When modern architects speak of biophilic design, of buildings that breathe and coexist with nature, they unknowingly echo the medieval way of building. Those thick, uneven walls that kept out cold also stored heat. Those narrow windows, so often dismissed as relics of fear, were calculated to balance light and safety. And those winding staircases, always turning clockwise, were not simply defensive. They created rhythm within the space, a sense of ascent, both physical and psychological. To live in such a structure was to live inside a system designed not for comfort, but for continuity. And that continuity, strangely enough, is what we crave today. In an age of glass towers and plastic walls, the solidity of a castle feels almost sacred. People travel across continents to touch those stones, to feel the weight of centuries pressing through their palms. Why? Because somewhere deep within us, we still hunger for permanence, for something the modern world cannot give. This yearning is not limited to historians or romantics. You can see it in the way castles dominate cinema, literature, and even digital spaces. Every fantasy kingdom, every role-playing game, every epic story begins with the image of a castle on a hill. It is a universal symbol of safety, of aspiration, of mystery. Even the word itself carries a kind of power. Castle. It feels solid when spoken, as though built of consonants in stone. That enduring power comes not just from the architecture itself, but from the idea behind it. The medieval castle is the ultimate expression of human control over chaos. It stands against time, against nature, against the unknown. And yet in the end, it is also humbled by those very forces. Every crack in the wall, every fallen tower, is a reminder that permanence is an illusion. But perhaps that is why castles fascinate us still. They embody the most human paradox of all, the desire to resist time, and the inevitability of being consumed by it. As the centuries turned and modernity advanced, these monuments began to fade from daily life. Gunpowder, cannons, and later artillery made them obsolete. The age of walls was over. Power now flowed through lines of communication rather than lines of defense. Yet as walls fell, memory deepened. In the 20th century, archaeologists began to approach castles not as curiosities, but as complex social systems. Excavations revealed traces of gardens, workshops, and even entertainment spaces. We learned that castles were not just built for war, they were centers of administration, culture, and community. Within their walls, trade was managed, disputes were settled, and art was nurtured. Even the smallest detail, the pattern of stone in a gatehouse, or the remnants of a spiral stair became part of a larger story about human ingenuity. You begin to realize that the genius of medieval castles was not in their power to repel, but in their power to endure through adaptation. And so, as the modern world turned its days forward, the castle remained, not as a relic, but as a teacher. It taught us that true strength lies not in size, but in balance, not in height, but in harmony, not in conquest, but in continuity. Now when you look at a castle illuminated at night, its towers silvered by moonlight, you might imagine that it sleeps, but in truth it watches. It has seen the rise and fall of kingdoms, the turning of wars into peace, the transformation of enemies into tourists. Its walls no longer guard soldiers, but stories. And maybe that is the most remarkable transformation of all. The fortress became a memory, and the memory became a home for all who seek the past.
You might think that the age of castles ended when their towers crumbled and their moats dried, but that would be a mistake. In truth, they never vanished. They simply transformed, just as the world itself did. The genius of their design, the logic, the craftsmanship, the emotional weight, continued to echo in ways their builders could never have imagined. When you walk through a modern city, passing under concrete archways and glass towers, you are surrounded by faint descendants of those same medieval forms. The castle did not die, it evolved. When the gunpowder age rendered high walls and arrow slits obsolete, architecture itself began to change. But the underlying principles that guided medieval design, balance, proportion, and defensive order remained. You can see it in everything from Gothic cathedrals to Georgian manors, and even in the neat symmetry of neoclassical government buildings. The human instinct to fortify space did not disappear with the drawbridge. It simply adapted to new threats and new dreams. Even as cannons shattered stone and revolutions tore down walls, people continued to build upward, to seek protection and permanence in height. The skyscraper, for all its steel and glass, is an echo of the keep, the inner tower of strength, rising above all else, the last refuge when all below has fallen. The tower became the emblem of modern ambition. Where once the Lord looked out over fields and forests, now executives look down on cities, bathed not in candlelight, but in the glow of screens. But beyond the material influence, there is something deeper, something psychological. Castles taught humanity how to imagine safety. Before the castle, security was personal. It belonged to the strong, the armed, the mobile. But the castle turned protection into architecture. It made safety something you could build, something that could endure beyond the lifespan of a man. This concept still governs our world today. Whether it is the layout of a family home, the encryption of your private data, or the boundaries of nations themselves, all of it descends from the medieval dream of controlled space. You might not think of yourself as living inside a fortress, but in many ways you do. Your walls, locks, gates, and passwords are modern moats. Your cameras and codes are sentinels. The medieval castle's layered defenses, designed to slow and exhaust intruders, are mirrored in the multi-tiered security systems that define digital and physical life today. Every time you cross a checkpoint, enter a password, or pass through a gated doorway, you are retracing the logic of the castle gatehouse. Yet for all its practicality, there was poetry in the old way of building. Medieval architects did not separate beauty from function. Even the narrowest arrow slit was carved with grace. Even the coldest stone stair spiraled in rhythm with the body's natural movement. Each element had purpose, defensive, aesthetic, or spiritual. There was no waste, no emptiness. Every corner was alive with meaning. You can sense that when you visit a castle ruin today. The stones may be broken, but their arrangement still makes sense to the eye. There is a kind of mathematical music to their placement. You might find yourself tracing your fingers over the cool wall of a gatehouse and feeling, though you do not know why, a strange peace. That is because medieval design was not built only for the eyes, but for the human spirit. Castles were not lifeless structures, they were expressions of belief.
To the masons who built them, each stone was not merely material, it was prayer. In an age when literacy was rare, architecture became the language of faith. The arch was a symbol of divine order, the tower of aspiration toward heaven, the enclosed courtyard of paradise protected from the wilderness beyond. Even the smallest detail, a carving, a window shape, the slope of a roof, was charged with intention. Consider, for example, the rhythm of light inside a great hall. Those high windows, narrow at the base and wide at the top, allowed sunlight to spill in at precise angles during certain hours of the day. The mornings were bright and sharp for work and order. The evenings were golden, soft, contemplative, perfect for the quiet after labor. It was not just design, it was choreography, guiding human experience through light and shadow. When night fell, torches and braziers transformed the stone walls into a living theater of movement. The flicker of firelight gave life to tapestries and carvings, made shadows dance like ghosts of memory. To live in such a space was to exist inside a shifting world of texture and light, where every sound, every movement carried weight. The very structure of the building taught people how to move slowly, deliberately, aware of the echo of their own footsteps. That awareness, the sense of rhythm and purpose in movement, survives in the way we still design sacred spaces, museums, and even homes. We arrange light, flow, and proportion to create a feeling, an atmosphere that speaks beyond words. It is no coincidence that modern architects study medieval structures for their mastery of human scale. Castles remind us that buildings are not machines, they are environments for emotion. But if there was genius in how castles were built, there was equal genius in how they were maintained. The work of keeping a fortress alive was constant, repairing mortar, tending fires, managing stores. The castle was not a static monument, it was a living organism that required care and attention every single day. In this, it mirrored the medieval world's understanding of continuity, that survival was not achieved through conquest, but through patience. It's tempting to romanticize the knights and lords who lived there, but the real custodians of those places were the craftsmen and servants. The stonemason who learned to read the flaws in rock by touch alone. The carpenter who shaped beams to fit arches so precisely that they would not move for centuries. The women who mended tapestries, cleaned the soot from walls, kept the hearths burning so that life could continue in the coldest winters. These were the unsung engineers of endurance. Their small acts of maintenance, repeated over generations, are what allowed the great castles to survive storms, sieges, and centuries of neglect. When you look upon a castle ruin today, you are not seeing the triumph of kings, you are seeing the legacy of their workers. In a way, that is the truest genius of medieval architecture, that it was built not just for glory, but for continuity. A single mason might carve one stone in his lifetime, but he did it knowing it would outlast him by centuries. There is humility in that, a recognition that creation can be both personal and eternal. And yet, as you stand before a ruin today, you cannot help but sense a sadness too. The same walls that once protected life are now exposed to the elements. The fires that once glowed within them have gone cold. Grass grows through flagstones that once echoed with the footsteps of generations. You might wonder, was it all in vain? But perhaps it was never meant to last forever. Perhaps the purpose of the castle was not to resist time, but to give time shape. Each ruin, in its decay, teaches you something that perfect structures cannot, that beauty and fragility are twins, and that permanence is found not in stone, but in memory. When the wind passes through an open arch or the sea crashes against a ruined wall, it creates a sound that has no beginning or end. It is the sound of continuity, the same sound the builders heard, the same sound you hear now. The stones may crumble, but the pattern remains. And so the medieval castle, once a fortress of war, becomes a monument to peace. Its battlements no longer bristle with archers, but with wildflowers. Its moats